William MacCrea came to teach in Andover in 1957, yes, 57? 58, where he taught for 31 years. In my own family, he was teaching when my mother was in school. And then when I was in school, my brothers, he gave nighttime lessons to adults. My grandmother took painting lessons from him. And if we had stayed at Andover and he had taught one more year, he would have had my oldest son. So we almost hit 4 generations in my family. I'm going to talk more about that history tomorrow during my talk in the morning. We have the pleasure of learning more about Scotty's work as presented by Scotty. So you're in for a rare treat, and it is my pleasure to introduce William MacCrea.
Thank you. I'll try to be heard. I'm battling pollen and everything else the old guys battle. Greg asked me if I would first discuss this piece that you see projected. It is not what we think of normally as Celtic art, but it has to do with a Celtic theme. And the reason that's very important to my family, I made it about 40 years ago. And the name of it is Imbolc, which is the 1st of January. It's the feast day of St. Bridget, but mainly Bridget, the earth goddess. So people say, well, is that St. Bridget of Kildare? Or is that Bridget, the earth mother? And I say, yes. Because in the Celtic mind, in the Gaelic mind, the Pictish mind, don't try to push us into too many corners. We are a highly imaginative people, a race that sits on a rock and dreams of a day that never was, but might be someday. This particular piece behind me, I made about 40 years ago. And I brought it forth and showed it to my wife. And I said, what do you think of this? And she said, it's mine. I was so flattered. I had no problem. I said, really? Because she had seen so many pieces of my work. And this one, she claimed to be hers. We were going to bring it over here, but you know what? I'm not so sure that she wanted me to take it out of the house. She's been gone now for 10 years, God bless her. But she was a wonderful, well, she was very supportive of me, her sons, grandsons. And so, anyway, Greg wanted me to speak of this piece, and as you see the figure in the center, and you'll see a head of a Roman bishop turned to one side, up above. Well, there's a reason for that. The Scots Highlanders insist that Bishop Mel consecrated St. Bridget of Kildare to be a full-fledged bishop of the south of Ireland. Now that's not unusual because some of the greatest mentors of the Irish saints were women. Cornwall was probably almost completely converted by St. Ia, or the English call St. Ives, St. Beha in the north, in Cumbria, and then over in Ireland, Eta, and Bridget of Kildare, unbelievable. What an influence she was on so many people. And so you see different forms of almost vegetation, seeds and so forth in this, and it isn't what we normally think of as Celtic art, but it has a Celtic theme. And our work sometimes goes like that as well. Down here, you see this one propped up in the chair. That's St. Brendan the Navigator, who we think got to North America long before Columbus. And of course, you probably read about the voyage of the Brendan in 1978, I think it was. but they sailed a ship that followed what had been written in the Voyage of Brendan. And it was covered with bullhide. And yes, they got into a return current, and they got as far as Labrador. Or no, Newfoundland, which is pretty good. If they hadn't run out of things, they probably would have gone right down to that catcher's mitt, which is, well, Cape Cod, Massachusetts. And so here they came, and I would be surprised if many, many times Irish sailors had not been blown off course, got into a return current, and come to these shores. The Saints of Ireland spoke of the land of the blessed, far beyond the Western Sea. So that is St. Brendan. And this one was kind of a fun thing. I did that for the Hardys. St. Kevin and the Blackbird. What a fantastic story. And of course, as you know, the Irish are great storytellers. Not that we Scots, we don't exaggerate like the Irish do. But anyway, I'm to talk to you today about identity, pride, and tradition. The diaspora. Well, let's go back a minute. You throw that term Celtic around. Well, Celtic isn't a race. If anything, it narrows down to a group of languages, Indo-European languages. Basically, Irish, Welsh, or Cymry, and Scottish Gaelic, Manx Gaelic. And of course, you have the people, the Cymric people of Wales, and the dialect that they speak in Brittany, which is very similar to Welsh. It really refers to linguistic groups. And when you say Celtic art, well, what is that? Are the people of Ireland or Scotland even Celts? Or are they speaking a language that was imposed upon them by an invading people? It's very possible. That's the way it happens. What happened to the Picts? They just didn't disappear. Their language died out. There's a movie that came out a year or two ago, The Eagle. Some of you may have seen it. It showed the Roman Ninth Legion, how they disappeared in the wilds of Caledonia. Those were the Picts. And I was interested because when they had the Picts speaking, they were speaking Gaelic. The Picts would not have been speaking Gaelic. But nobody knows what the Pictish language sounds like. It's gone. And it went a long time ago. Mrs. Black can tell you a lot more about the Picts. But they made all sorts of things. There were red Picts, they said, and there were black Picts. The red-headed Picts were the Clan Cotton people, the cat people. And then you had these other people who were dark Picts or black Picts, and they were smaller. But they didn't know what to call them, so they called them black Picts. Well, they were probably what the Romans called the Atticoti, the Atticots, an ancient indigenous people. They may have been the ones that started building Brochs, we don't know. The round, tower-like centers where they would, they would defend themselves. And those things are ingenious. But there have been so many peoples over there. Ireland had Picts, as well as Scotland had them. And we know that the Picts used more representational art than the Gaels did. We talk about America as it's a melting pot. Hoo-hoo, Ireland, Scotland, they were melting pots long, long before we came along. I doubt that there's many families in Ireland that doesn't have some Danish blood. And in Scotland, that's true. The old people said they were forever putting dirks at one another's throats and rings upon one another's fingers. And that seems to be so. And we speak a language called English. I'm not Anglo-Saxon. fact, when my kids misbehaved at table, I would say to them, "Gaan je aan het aksaten?" And they would straighten right up. There is nothing in you but English, which meant you had bad manners. And the language, English, Barla, translates to gibberish. They speak gibberish. But anyway, we talk about the diaspora. This group of people who somehow came out of the mother countries, and some of them came out of the continent of Europe, some of them came from Ireland, Scotland, Wales. And we talk about these people. What happened to them? And, well, they're the dispossessed of Europe. Europe was pretty lucky for a couple, 300 years. They had a place to dump their unwanted people. But they made one mistake over here. They managed to knock down some of those big trees. And within 20 or 30 years, they had a better standard of living than the folks back home. That wasn't supposed to happen. So here were these people, and we find that the diaspora, the people outside of the mother countries, and the people back there share many things in common. They have many things, and they give to one another. You know, we think about the Scots in Canada, and we think about the Irish in the States. The first people that came over after the Jacobite uprising. The Scots came into North Carolina, some of them into Georgia. The Irish, after the year of the French, they had to get lost. They had to find their way out of there. That was 1793, I believe. And they came to the American South. That was the 18th century. In the 19th century, the potato famine. You know, everybody knows about that. And, of course, for the Scots, the clearances. The clan system having been destroyed, chiefs had to pay taxes. Where would they get money? There was no such thing. Their followers had always served them in different ways, by being able to bear a sword, or act as a Jew, a keeper of a family or religious treasure. They all had a place. There was the piper and so forth. But now there was no place for these people. And they were opening up to new methods of farming. So they burned the thatch, tumbled the walls, broke the meal chests, scattering winter's food all over the rock. And these people had to leave. And they weren't all poor people who left. My own ancestors came into Canada in 1832, and they brought furniture with them. But back in those days, it wasn't just leaving a place. You were leaving knowing that you would never probably return. Even the mail service wasn't something you could depend upon. And so they came over here. And what happened? Strange things happened. Ancient memories just kept popping up. And of course, in the 19th century, when the Irish came, they came for the States. They didn't want any more to do with the British Empire, whereas Canada was trying to establish a greater English-speaking presence west of Quebec, and so they welcomed the Scots Highlanders in. And oddly enough, the two cultures nourish one another, the one at home and the one overseas. And I'll get into that in a bit. It's kind of interesting, the things that they remembered. You know, we heard stories of our clan feuds and everything. And, but we didn't hear, what the world doesn't hear, is the stories of our very deep friendships among certain families and clans. The MacCreas, for example, have a very deep friendship with Clan Fraser. When I was a sailor out of boot camp waiting in a station to receive my assignment, a gangly young guy from the south, from another barracks, came in and said, "I was told your name is MacCrea." I said, "That's right." He said, "I was always told if I met a MacCrea, I was to make myself known. I'm from the Clan Fraser, and I was told you people are like kin to us." We gave each other a hug. It went way back to something that happened in the 1400s when two MacCrea brothers saw an elderly man being attacked by three younger men. And it turned out that that older man was the chief of the Frasers of Bissett. We remember these stories because they've been handed down. Further to that, years later, probably 100 years later, MacCrea of Clunes sent his son to be fostered on the household of Fraser of Bissett. And the boy was about 14 or 15, and there was a young chief of the Frasers and his young wife, and they had an infant daughter. And there were some hotheads, a bad element of the clan, who resented his chiefship, and they broke into the castle, and they killed the young chief and his wife. And the young MacCrea ran into the room where the little girl, the baby was, the infant, and he put his plate on the floor, put the baby in it, and slung the plate over his shoulder and ran for his father's country. They raised the girl until she was 18, and they made application to Lyon Court that she be recognized as the rightful chief of the Frasers. She was, and she erected a stone in front of Beaufort Castle. As long as a Fraser resides within, no MacCrea shall lodge without. The MacCrea is not to be outdone. Put it over the entryway to Eilindonan. As long as a MacCrea resides within, no Fraser shall lodge without. After that young guy met me, about 2 weeks later, I was in New York City, close to where the steamships came in. And a man and his wife, with luggage, came into this coffee place, and there was a light snow blowing, and you could see it on the lady's fur collar. And I looked across, and I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, isn't that the crest of Clan Fraser of Lovett?" And she said, "Well, yes." I said, "How would you know that?" And I said, "I should have introduced myself. My name is William MacCrea." And she turned to her husband and she said, "How about that, Ian? The first American to speak to us, and he's a MacCrea." Interesting. They saw that as good luck. So anyway, all these people coming in, and you begin to wonder. Well, I came as a teacher. I wasn't supposed to be a teacher. I was supposed to be a designer. But there was a rough old guy over here who was principal, and I had done a little practice teaching just to see what it was like. And he asked me to come into his office. I went over on the last day. I was cleaning out tests and glazed tiles and so forth. That was a mess. And I thought, oh boy, what have I done now? So I went over there. And he looked at me and said, "Are you going to teach these kids or not?" I said, "Excuse me?" So are you going to teach these kids next year or not? These McMichaels will appreciate it. They know the way he talked. And I said, "No." He said, "Why not? Don't you like them?" I said, "I think they're the most beautiful kids I've ever seen. They're imaginative. They're resourceful. They're beautiful kids." Well, you know, these people are giving me too much credit. I didn't teach them Celtic art. They dragged that out of me. I don't know whether they discovered Celtic art or where Celtic art found them. I came into this school. Listen, these are the kind of names. Cannon, Campbell, Gavin, Lynch, McCormick, Doherty, Slade, McNeil, McGillivray, McMichael, Lang, Brown, Bruce, Wallace, Clark, Donaldson, Walker, McClure. It was like reading the roll of the Irish septs and the Scottish clans. But here's an interesting thing about this. One thing happened among the diaspora that didn't happen at home. Religion had kept us apart over there. Not so much the Highlanders. A lot of the West Highlanders, if they weren't Catholic, they kept the old Celtic way. And, but there wasn't that cooperation. On this side of the sea, we had to lean on one another for help. And boy, that took root in Andover. But I got to go back. Again, when I was a sailor, I was in New York City, and I'd gone up to play the bagpipe, practice my bagpipe with a pipe band up in the Bronx. Coming back down through Manhattan, I passed by a place called the Leitrim Castle. And a man came out and he said, "Sailor, do you play those?" I said, "I do." "Oh," he said, "come in and give us a couple of tunes." And I said, "Well," he said, "No, do." So I went on in. Oh boy. It was like I landed in the middle of the IRA. In those days, in American bars, there was always a glass jar. And it was never labeled. But there was always money. Not coins, bills in these jars. Guess where that money was going? Don't ask. Well, those were those days. And so I met with these guys. There were 3 guys, and one of them was an Irish dancer. And he took a couple of mop handles and put them on the floor, and he did the sword dance. And, oh boy, they said. Then his brother came to me and said, "I just called over to my mother's, and they want you to come home with us to Brooklyn." I said, "Are you kidding?" He said, "We're going to have a Kaylee." I said, "It'll be 2 o'clock in the morning before we get to Brooklyn." "Oh, it doesn't matter." They called in the neighbors. Well, I went with them. And here were Irish neighbors, Scottish people also. And they started singing, and I played the pipes, and they did some dancing. And on it went. And I hear the Irish singing Kevin Barry, and the Scots singing Standard on the Braes of Mar. I found out we were all a bunch of bloody Jacobites. But anyway, what I wanted to tell you most was a few weeks later, I got to know those guys pretty well. So I walked down, my ship was in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. So I walked down to see these guys and thought we'd spend the evening. There, the 3 of them were on another opposite corner. They said, "Liam, come with us." I said, "Where are you going?" "We're going to Irish class." I said, "Oh yeah, right. What bar is that?" And they said, "No, really, we're going to Irish class. Come with us." Irish class. All right. Well, my great-great-grandfather was the last person probably in the family who could read or write the old language. We grew up listening to it. When I was a kid, I just thought that's the way old people talk. But I wouldn't have been able to read or write a bit of it. So I went to this place with him, and there was a man, I think he was a priest. He didn't have the collar, but he was all in black. And we exchanged some words and so forth, and he'd question the way I pronounced something. And they had a large group of people, which after their initial meeting would divide into 4 groups depending on their proficiency. And he announced to them all, before we divide into our various groups, we have a rare opportunity tonight to hear a very ancient dialect of Old Irish. And I thought, wow. And he handed me a book. And I said, Misha, me. And he said, Liam du MacCrea, do you mean to tell me that you can read and write the language of our oppressors, and you cannot read and write the language of your own people, and you, from a family of tutors and bards that go a long way back? He knew that. Well, they taught me, he said, you can't learn any younger. And the Irish of New York taught me to read and write. And to this day, when I write in the old way, which even the Irish don't use anymore. The lenition was done by putting a dot over the top of the consonant, rather than follow it with an H. And they do that now. I suppose it's because of typewriters and computers, I don't know. But I was in Scotland and talking to Sir William Currie, who was the last bard of the Clan Ronald MacDonald's. And I jotted something down, and he said, where did you learn to write like that? And I said, well, I learned that from the Irish in New York. He said, up until the end of the 1600s, both Scots and Irish wrote like that. He said, I don't think even the Irish do anymore. Don't lose it. And then he gave me a book. And he said, I want you to have this book because before the MacCreas and the Curries ever left Ireland, we were late people. We didn't go into Scotland in the early days. He said, your ancestors were tutors to my ancestors. Your ancestors were tutors to the bards of the O'Donnells of Antrim. And I said, oh. So I found out, yeah. And he gave me this book on Highland superstitions. He said, your chief gave that to me when I was a boy. He said, that was Sir Colin MacCrea of Inverness. Well, what about all this? Well, I never taught a class in Celtic art. These kids dragged it out of me. They really did. I had 3 periods a week where I didn't have a class. I'd be in my art room, and all the kids found out, okay, somebody'd be there, so they asked if they could have a pass, come in and work on their own work. And then they would look and say, something that I would be doing, more of the interlacing than this one behind me. And you're going to teach us to do that? And I'd say, no. You'd only mess it up. I used reverse psychology a lot. Well, then you couldn't stop them. They got downright angry. And I remember I had one student who lived on, well, I had to drive home past his place. He missed his bus 3 times. So he had a ride with me. And I said, do you have something, on the 3rd trip, I said, do you have something you want to talk to me about? He said, yeah, I want you to show me how to express myself. I said, what are you kidding? You're very articulate. You're well-spoken. Have a good command of the language. He said, I don't mean that. He said, we have relatives in Scotland. We have a right to this. And you have to share it with us. And I thought, oh, that. Well, another place that it showed up, I'd start kids about 12, teaching them in order for them to understand the value of line, thin and thick, round, and so forth. And so I would teach them calligraphy. And they'd be 12, 13 years old. They took to it like a duck to water. And, to make, it'd be dramatic, I remember a few times I would use goose quills or turkey quills, show them how to sharpen quill music before they go on to metal nibs. And they loved it. Well, all of a sudden, the junior high English teacher came to see me. She said, you know, I'm very proud of my Irish blood. I said, yes, I know. But as an English teacher for middle school students, I have to insist that they learn and maintain a good use of cursive writing. And I said, yes. She said, they're not doing that. They're writing in uncials. And I said, really? I wonder. She said, yes, I wonder where they learned that. So, and sure enough, and that sort of thing began to happen more and more and more. And so, yeah, they found they had an identity. I'd say to a kid, you really feel something about this? Why? He said, I'm Irish. Or I'm Scottish. Oh. Of course, people in the old country would say to us sometimes, oh, you're more Scottish than we are. I said, are you sure about that? Or maybe are you trying to be more American than I am? Oh. You want to dump your past, do you? We haven't done that. And people over there, you know, well, we don't understand. Scottish Americans playing the pipes and wearing the kilt and so forth. Well, great-grandmother had an answer for that. She said, you know, if the cat gives birth in a corner of the hen house, she doesn't give birth to chicks now, does she? That old way of putting things, boy, she never failed. But anyway, when you stop to think about it, these kids carried a lot that they'd hear stories. And you'd say, where did your ancestors come from? Well, my grandfather always said, County Mayo, God bless us. And they would always say that. Was Mayo that bad? Apparently it was pretty bad. But they still had this thing. The Scots coming into Canada. You know, the Canadian boat song, it says, from the lone Shéalin on a misty island, mountains divide us and a waste of seas. Still, the blood is strong. The heart is Highland. And in our dreams, we see the Hebrides. Fair these broad meads, these hoary woods are grand, but we are exiles from our father's land. Walking the heather tracks in the West Highlands where my people come from, I felt that very keenly. I felt it very, very keenly. My grandsons said they felt the same thing. There they were with an American passport in their pockets, walking trails which other people had traveled with the germ of their possibility in their bodies. But we are exiles. Well, what happens with all this? Well, the two strains nourish one another. It isn't a one-way street. The Canadians have played a tremendous role in sending back to Scotland people who would help in reestablishing Scottish Gaelic, particularly from Nova Scotia. And I remember I was asked one time, sent something over from Scotland, and they asked if I would translate this from English into Scots Gaelic, something to be read in the Scots Parliament. Well, I did, and 2 days later I sent it back with the question, why? With Celtic chairs at universities, are you asking a North American to translate this? And the answer came back, because your Gaelic is older and more poetic. Well, that's true of the English we speak, you know. I taught school in England for 1 year. And the fifth-year boys, every once in a while, would hit on a word. Sir, is there such a word? I said, get the dictionary. Look at this, chap. Archaic. still used in the U.S. and Canada. You speak archaically, sir. I said, well, somebody has to hold on to your language for you. And that was the way of it. And I remember reading in a 1927, I got a hold of an old copy of Transactions of the Gaelic Society of Inverness. And in that particular article, they mentioned that the harping tradition in Scotland had pretty well died out, as it had in Ireland. And they mentioned in the article that as far as they knew, there were only 2 of the clarsach, the old Celtic harps, left, and they were both in museums. Well, it didn't die out. Because if the harpistry had died out in Ireland, it hadn't died out among the Irish of South Boston and Philadelphia or Chicago. Today, you can make a pretty good living if you can make clarsach. A lot of teenagers are playing them in both of those countries now. It's gone back. And over here, there are probably more people who speak Scots Gaelic in North America than there probably are back home. See, I said it, back home. Because every once in a while, Scottish people say, when are you coming home? I'll say, America's our Scotland now. Oh, I know, but you got to come home sometime. And, but anyway, we take a certain liberty. You know, when I sit here and in the presence of people such as Dr. McGahan, these are people who are keeping a very ancient tradition. And this is beautiful. But we have these things that we just feel free to go and do as we will, as long as we keep the rules. And I remember there was a rather well-known practitioner of the old art from Ireland. And my grandson was in Walker's studio mapping out a Celtic design. And the fellow asked him, he said, "Is that coming out of your head?" My grandson Alex said, "Yeah." "Don't you have templates or anything?" He said, "What's a template?" And he said, "Well, you know, I have a considerable file of templates that," he said, "my grandfather would kick me if I used a template." It's supposed to come out of the head, you know? And it did. Well, anyway, what this led to, there again, Andover in those days was fighting the last of the Reformation. You had Protestants on one side, Catholics on the other. But you know what? This art somehow formed a bridge. Irish kids, Scottish kids, they were helping each other. And a lot has happened since then. And we can do that over here. In my own clan country, it's not so rare to see people from the Republic of Ireland because they go over there to play shinty with the Highlanders. But in a lot of parts of Scotland, that would not be so. I remember reading in the 1990s in an Irish-American journal at that time, which was called Unscahan, The Mirror. And there was a young Irish-American complaining, how long are we going to leave it to the Scottish Highlanders to carry our traditions for us? Why aren't more Irishmen wearing the kilt? Why aren't more Irishmen playing the pipes and forming pipe bands? Well, it wasn't too many years ago, 3-4 years ago, I was at Altamont by Albany for the New York State Highland Games. And the massed pipes and drums came onto the field. They were playing Scotland the Brave. And when they went down all the length and ready to go into their counter march, they broke into the Minstrel Boy, because there were 2 or 3 Irish pipe bands. And you go to Scottish games today, and there's Scottish dancing and there's Irish dancing. And you see pipers from both. We've been able to do that over here. And that leads to a certain pride. It wasn't long after these kids started fooling around with this Celtic art. And I had no idea myself until that show that they put on a year ago. And I saw all these former students had been doing this stuff. And they were amazing. It was good. It was well done, very well executed. And I thought, where have I been? Well, they said, you ever look at your own house? You know, in the ceramics and in the furniture. There's Celtic art everywhere. Huh, yeah, I guess there is. And people are comfortable with it. And yet there are other things that we had to address. The kids got into the point where they were doing more. They took pride. They started illustrating things like the stories of, Fian McCool, Deirdre of the Sorrows, the Sons of Ushnik, and various stories from the old cattle raid of Cooley and so forth. And the stories of Fian, Cormac MacCrea. If you go to our place, Locust Way, I don't know who made that, but on the wall there's an illuminated thing. O Cormac, O grandson of Khan, what were your habits when you were a lad? Not hard to tell, said Cormac, if you will listen to my teaching. I was a gazer in woods, a listener. Or I was a gazer at stars, a listener in wood. I was unseeing among secrets. I did not deride the old, though I was young. I did not deride the weak, though I was strong. And this is the sort of thing they were doing. I didn't tell them to do it, but they would do it. And then all of a sudden you found out that some of them were going up further north for Irish classes. Or like Mary Ann McClure became a Highland dancer. And all of this kept going. And I look at my grandsons, my great-grandchildren, a couple of whom are pestering me for phrases in the gallery, which is interesting. My one great-grandson, Ronan, he was sitting in the same room with his sister who was scowling at him. And he said, how do I tell Tegan she's a fool? I said, oh, you can't say that in the gallery. He said, well, how do I say it? So I told him, She Amadana Hanat. But it doesn't mean the same. So he repeated it until he didn't have an accent. She Amadana Hanat. It is the fool that is in you. It's much more polite. The fool may not have been there yesterday. The fool may not be there tomorrow. But it's the fool that's in you now. She, continuing to scowl, said, when he talks like that, what do I say to him? I said, oh, probably, she skalaka yours. So she repeated that. She skalaka yours. It is a slap that you are needing. It's a lovely language. And it wouldn't do for physics. It wouldn't do for high technology. But it lends itself to poetry and storytelling. So all of the stuff that we see, it becomes a part and parcel of everything. It leads to tradition. And people say, oh, wouldn't it be nice to have tradition? You think so? Tradition is a lot of work. It doesn't mean what you feel like doing right now. There's a tradition to be upheld, and if you're called upon to do it, you do it. In America, there's now a tradition that's been here for close to 50 years, that at the funeral of brave warriors, soldiers, fallen firemen or policemen, you have a piper. Sometimes it's a Scottish piper, sometimes it's an Irish one. The piper says, I don't know whether I have time. No. He finds time. And he doesn't take money. Because it's an honor. Tradition. Tradition has a cost. But if your children see and feel what you're doing, trying to do, then this tradition becomes meaningful. And not only does it become meaningful for keeping old ways alive, it becomes something that you can offer this new land. And, I think about all my former students, and I can't think of any of them who would be, not a one of them, has become a burden on society. They've all found their own way. When Steve Walker, I couldn't help him all the way. When he was in about 10th grade, I think it was, he told me that he wanted to learn how to work Celtic design in silver or gold. I said, oh, Steve, I can't help you. Let me see what I can do. Well, there was a woman in another town, Friendship, New York, who had lost her husband. She had made jewelry. Her name was Nancy McDermott. And I called her and I said, would you be willing to take one of my students for an afternoon a week and teach him something about jewelry? And she said, I'll check with my superintendent. So she got back to me a couple days later and she said, yes, I'll do that under one condition. I have a girl who wants to learn wood carving. I said, fine. And it worked out. It worked out. I think it was the next year, Steve Walker walked up to Eric McMichael and said, hey, McMichael, I'm starting a Scottish Renaissance. Are you in on it or not? Yes. And it's wonderful, really, when you see what these people have done with their lives, the attitudes they have toward this country, and the honor that they have for their ancestors. I remember when I was a sailor, I was a piper on our ship. Most people don't realize that some American ships have bagpipers. That goes all the way back to John Paul Jones. He would not put to sea without a piper. And so I was a piper. But it was kind of interesting because a ship came in from New Zealand and they had a piper. And his nickname was Scotty. And we spoke together. Him with his New Zealand accent, me with my Western New York / Canadian accent. Then he says, where do you come from? And I said, the hills. New York just. New York has hills. I said, oh, aye. Then he said to me, and you're Gaelic, I said, I get you. In those languages, we sounded like we came from the same place. Because we only said the way. I asked him, tell me something of a person of Scottish heritage. What do you feel most keenly? He said, probably the same thing you do. I said, what's that? The eyes of the ancestors? He said, yes. What is there about that? And we use that term, when I'm gathered to my ancestors. And boy, the Scots and Irish can be pretty unforgiving, so I think I'd be happy that the Lord is doing the judging and not them. But anyway, you go to the events today and you see both, and you see these people coming together. And yet, Irish, Scottish, and a person comes right out and says, I'm Irish, or I'm Scottish. Well, he's American, that's a given, but that's a national identity. It's a national. Of course we love our country. Of course we're proud of our country. But we also have a lot to carry that's been given and handed down to us. And so basically what I'm saying is that it's these people who have done this. When Greg Hardy, the fellow who spoke to you here, his brother, in his senior year of high school when he left, he made a cross for me. And I've worn it ever since. And it's very well done, oddly enough. Has a piece of Iona marble in the middle. And what a wonderful experience. And to think that this goes on. So take a good look at all of those things and realize that all these young people, and I often, as an old guy, say to people, well, you cut it out. You say, the trouble with the young people today, they had everything handed to them. Well, why did you give it to them? Why don't you shut up or not give it at all? And, what is this all about anyway? People who dishonor their descendants are every bit as bad as people who will dishonor their ancestors. This is what's left of you. This is what's going on into this world. And it isn't always like people think either. I remember my son Rory and I were in disagreement about something one day, and he said, well, don't worry about it. My kids will disagree with me and they'll agree with you. And that is so often true, isn't it? Oh well, revenge, I suppose. I really don't have much more to say except the praise that I have for these people and what they've been able to bring about. And they are the ones. They are the stars. They had to drag this out of me. Well, not really. But, it's been wonderful. And I really don't have that much more to say. If any of you have any questions, I'd be happy to hear them. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. There's one thing I do want to say before there's one, but it's not mine. In other ways, we did some illuminating and so forth. And this is a book of saints' days. And we keep those. And once in a while, people, they write their poems and they illustrate them. And we have with us, in fact, today, a young woman who has been honored by the American Academy of Poets. And she served as a bardist to our people. And she handed me this, handwritten in her own hand, several poems on the illuminations. And I want to read this to you as a closing remark, really. It's called Gathering Song, Over the Water. Gather round me gather, in this candle-fired room, alive with flickering shadows reeling along these wood-framed walls. The shadows pass quick as grace notes. Pay little heed, but pay heed to the puzzling ghosts. Flame tongue speaks you a sharper lore. Reeling in time to this tapping foot, body, spirit, swayed. Gather round and think me not mad, but fill my glass if my soul has not gone blind. And fill my glass again, if you would call me bard. Blame me not if no one sees for me. Then once again we'll dance and throw our laughter to the night. Now tear from your hearts, do not be angry. Tear away from the rich red of your hearts, the woven cloth, tapestry that binds you, and the threads of its history spun fine, soaked years in the miles of salt crossing, salt bleaching, salt settled in the taste of blood, staining the swords salt ate. As it poured on claymore, the blade, tearing through the cloth of the plaid, stripped from bodies to beat low the ravaging flames that dry the seawater, fountains of your eyes. Then listen. Oak leaves sound like green wood on the fire. Red stag prances along the forest's edge. On rocky slopes, you gaze through a valley depth of air. Turning to the peak, the stag tosses his antlers. Turning, you nod and move on to the falls. But do those falls run from the hunt, run red from the hunt? Do they curtain the game's hiding home cave from the screams of Culloden's nameless children? The ashes of emptied rook-covered stone, houses that crumble from fear, and lonely the bloodstone that protects you, the stone of the hallowed mountain. Pile if you pass this way, the stone. You are not stone, hard, cold tears. Wetting walls never left stone heart's cave. The falls runs white, like the soul of a sail. Now listen. Child voices sound like streams singing down the mountain. Your children dance naked along the pond's shore. By firelight, these old songs sound from spirit-tuned drones. And at Locust Brae, we gather, love-bound hearts, to Locust Brae, our glasses raised to life that has not died, has not died, has not died.
Thank you, Diane.
Well, it hasn't died, has it? Thanks again.